New Orleans Saints training camp kicks off in a little bit over a week, and while all eyes will be fixed on the quarterback position, some will not be looking at Derek Carr. We got all of that and a little bit of lanyard for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're taking a look at training camp battles. I'm going to explain to you why I do not believe that the third wide receiver role is completely sewn up. We'll take a look at how defensive backs have a real case to make some of the biggest shakeups throughout training camp when it comes to their position battles. And we'll kick off with a look at the quarterbacks and what will be the one position battle that everyone will be paying attention to, but that ideally will have no impact in 2024. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making us your first listen of the day every day here on the show, and for being an everydayer here on the podcast, which is a proud part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed over at Game Time. Appreciate you very much, as always, for being here, y'all. And we are going to dive into these training camp battles for the New Orleans Saints going into 2024. Starting off with what is the most anticipated battle of training camp that ideally has no bearing on how things end up at the end of the 2024 NFL season. Yes, it is the quarterback battle between Jake Haener and Spencer Rattler. The biggest question mark for me when it comes to this quarterback battle is, what does it really mean, right? We're talking about the backup to Derek Carr. Now, don't get me wrong. Saints fans and a lot of NFL fans here recently have had a pretty bad case of backup quarterback syndromes. Here in New Orleans, when it wasn't, or when it was set to be Jameis Winston, everyone wanted Taysom Hill. When it wasn't set to be Jameis Winston, all of a sudden everyone wanted Jameis Winston again. Last year, we certainly saw that. This year, now the New Orleans Saints go in with their second year with Derek Carr, and some are already saying that they'd rather see Jake Haener or Spencer Rattler. Now, I think everyone would say that until they saw Jake Haener and Spencer Rattler this early in their career. Probably not going to get something as polished as what you might, or at least have a better chance of getting with Derek Carr, who overall made a lot of good decisions last year. Didn't really pick things up, as was the truth for the rest of the offense, until later on in the season. And I still think is a guy that could certainly take some more risks as well. Still plays a little bit risk averse. We'll see if this new offense gives him an opportunity to be able to do that, or creates more separation for wide receivers in such a way that maybe he doesn't have to take the risk, but can still generate some more of those bigger plays. So right now, going into training camp, this is Derek Carr's team. There's no quarterback battle at that spot. There is indeed, though, a quarterback battle for who will be the legitimate backup behind Derek Carr. And by the way, of course, whoever wins QB2 will still end up, ideally, with fewer quarterback snaps than Taysom Hill, who, although he wouldn't be the bona fide backup to Derek Carr, will actually see quarterback snaps in 2024 alongside DC. So the way that I look at where the New Orleans Saints are going with all of this is simply trying to figure out which of their two young quarterbacks has made the most progress over the course of this offense, looking in this offensive system. Jake Haener enters with a little bit of seniority. He was drafted in the 2023 NFL draft, while Spencer Rattler was brought in this offseason. So while one is walking into their second year, the other, Rattler, is walking into his rookie season. So that immediately gives Jake Haener at least a little bit of an edge. However, everything's new. New offensive coordinator, new quarterback coach, right? Everything's new when it comes to the position coaches and the coaching staff that most immediately affects that position and those guys, their development and their growth. New Orleans Saints have made a major philosophical change in terms of the way that they are approaching their quarterback of the future search, and the way that they're approaching their backup quarterback search behind Derek Carr. They're not looking at an established veteran. Sure, Nathan Peterman's on the roster, but that feels like a little bit more of a training camp roster, not a 53-man roster type of signing. Jake Haener, Spencer Rattler, I expect that both of them will make the roster behind Derek Carr. but it will be up to their performances in training camp, where some you will see, I imagine, Jake Haener getting second team snaps on some days, Spencer Rattler getting second team snaps on other days. They'll probably alternate those opportunities, or at least give them an equal amount of opportunities throughout camp. And then we'll see how they break out preseason as well, which will be very important, I imagine. But that's where a lot of eyes are going to be. Those are the guys that are going to be in competition for the QB2 spot behind Derek Carr. And ideally for the New Orleans Saints, Derek Carr doesn't miss any games, and therefore they don't have to find out if one of these guys is ready sooner rather than later. Instead, give them the development time that they need, to where it increases the opportunity for one of those guys to potentially pan out, or at least more likely pan out, make it more likely that they do pan out, to be your future quarterback post Derek Carr, or at least somebody that will compete with other future options, because I doubt the New Orleans Saints are going to limit themselves to just these two guys as things continue to move ahead going into the 2025 NFL draft, especially considering where the New Orleans Saints might be picking at that point. And still, again, another talented quarterback crop here in 2025. So everyone's going to be paying attention to it, but ideally for the New Orleans Saints, this QB2 battle never ends with one of them actually seeing the field for meaningful snaps, at least during the regular season and hopeful postseason run. Now, the position group battle that I believe will have the greatest impact will be that of left guard, interior offensive line, where the New Orleans Saints have struggled in recent years and certainly struggled on their offensive line last year. The Saints were pretty solid, actually, when it came to their offensive line's pass protection on first and second downs, but took a major step back in late downs, dropping big-time DVOA rankings, all of these other pieces. So the New Orleans Saints getting some of that interior offensive line a little bit more sewn up after having to maybe, shift some guys around and do things all last year with Andrews Pete bouncing out to the outside, James Hurst dealing with injury, all this other stuff. It was a tough season for the New Orleans Saints when it came to that position. And now you've got a lot of guys that are going to be competing there. Second year guy, Nick Saldiveri, probably the favorite for right now. Veteran Shane Lemieux comes into the conversation along with veteran Lucas Patrick. And soon, I imagine that veteran offensive lineman Ali Udoh, who had previously spent time with Klint Kubiak in Minnesota, guy who is a career tackle, but then has played some on the interior throughout his NFL career. Some would argue that he played a little bit more out of position when he was on the interior than when he was at tackle, but we'll see where things go when we finally get an opportunity to get a better look at him throughout training camp, as he was kind of undergoing that ramp-up period, recovering from, I believe it was the quadriceps injury, if I remember correctly, with him, that kind of kept him limited throughout OTAs and minicamp. But that position and that battle is going to be pivotal to the New Orleans Saints' success, because the offensive line will be pivotal to the New Orleans Saints' offensive success in their new system going into 2024, not only from a pass protection standpoint, but what they will be tasked to do in the run game. It's going to be a much more active run game that's going to demand a lot of not only athleticism, but physicality, snap, get off the ball, all these other things. So that position group battle right there at left guard, I think, is going to have big time impact on whether the New Orleans Saints find success or struggle in their new offense in 2024. Coming up next, the defensive backs have a real chance to shake some things up. And in both cases, it's the young guys that could come in and make things a little bit more interesting than maybe we expect. We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Game Time is absolutely obsessed with helping you find the best deals when it comes to last-minute tickets to any of the events that are in your area, whether you're looking at football, basketball, baseball, perhaps with the MLB season continuing to roll along. They also have stuff for concerts, comedy, theater, and many other events that might be in your area. And they do everything that they can to make the ticket buying experience, even late in the game, transparent, easy for you to manage on their easy to navigate app, which allows you to be able to toggle on all-in pricing, which allows you to have no surprise fees by the time that you get to checkout. Seat views, panoramic views as well, to where you can actually see the view from your seats before you buy the tickets, and much, much more. Go and check them out today, because Game Time is taking all the guesswork out of buying tickets. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, Redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, family. It is rookie cornerback Kool-Aid McKinstry out of Alabama that could make things very, very, very interesting come training camp when it comes to a couple of different position battles. And of course, second-year safety Jordan Howden can make things interesting, along with a slew of veterans at the safety position as well. Here to break it all down today, we appreciate you very much for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to go and check out that Locked On Sports 24/7 stream as well, giving you all the biggest stories from around the world of sports, but the folks that know the teams that are making those big stories the best here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Go and check them out today. You can find the Locked On Sports Today stream on the Locked On Sports Today YouTube page and on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app as well. Part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I think New Orleans Saints cornerback Kool-Aid McKinstry could be the rookie that makes the most noise during training camp. Let's really think about this, right? Even if Spencer Rattler makes a lot of noise, it's sewing up a QB2 spot, which, as we mentioned, might not actually see meaningful snaps in 2024. Taliesin Fuanga, who, of course, was the first round selection for the New Orleans Saints, isn't really going to make a ton of noise because everyone already expects him to start. He likely will start. He's living up to expectation in that situation. The big question with him is, does he start at left tackle or right tackle? That'll be what we're watching there. Then we look at the rest of the rookies. Bub Means could potentially make some noise for sure. You could look at linebacker Jalen Ford, but he's not going to be stealing any starting roles, more than likely. Same thing for Christian Boyd, who of course can be excellent. And then of course Josiah Aziram, who they drafted in the 7th round, is a player that has probably a little bit more of a developmental piece. I imagine a practice squad year in 2024 makes sense for him, and then we'll see what he can develop into come 2025. He's only been playing the position for the last couple of years after switching over from the defensive line to the offensive line. So for me, when it comes to the player that can have the biggest kind of boost, I guess, in terms of where he is right now and where he plays in 2024, could be Kool-Aid McKinstry. Why? Because McKinstry is an incredibly talented corner. In fact, he's a perfect corner for the New Orleans Saints system. He's somebody that Joe Woods and Marcus Robertson and Dennis Allen look at as a perfect fit for what it is the New Orleans Saints do from a scheme perspective. He played some of the most press man coverage snaps in Alabama's defense, which played some of the most press man coverage snaps in all of college football. And now he's landed in New Orleans, a place that just played, yeah, you guessed it, the most press man coverage snaps in last season's NFL. So he does what it is that the New Orleans Saints want him to do. And you heard him a lot all throughout his Zoom press conference when he met with us after he was selected, when he met with media after he was selected, talking about doing things the right way, learning his fundamentals, so he always has something to fall back on. I'm telling you right now, that is music to all the New Orleans Saints coaching staff's ears to have a player that talks like that. Now, don't forget, too, that Kool-Aid McKinstry brings a little bit of returner opportunity for you, so maybe we'll get a little bit of a look at him there with the new kickoff rules. Got to have 2 returners back for every kickoff. Also has some punt return ability, things like that too. Feels like that's going to be Rashid Shaheed's job no matter what. But just something to also keep in mind, not to be surprised when you hear that Kool-Aid McKinstry was returning kicks and or returning punts or doing something in special teams at some point all throughout training camp. But the biggest thing too that he will be able to do is compete at both outside corner and on the inside in the slot. Now, the Saints are very confident that he can play either one of those positions, even though he played less than 30 slot snaps during his entire career over in Alabama. Now, the New Orleans Saints, that didn't stop them when it came to Alontae Taylor, who played just over 40 over the course of his time at Tennessee, and then the Saints still were comfortable putting him in the slot. But I will say that now they believe that the floor for Alontae Taylor coming into 2024 at that position starts where his ceiling was last year. So they expect him to get exponentially better, with even defensive coordinator Joe Woods, who specializes in the secondary, saying they didn't really put him in the best position to succeed, saying basically they didn't do him any favors last year. And so I'm sure that they'll do him some favors this year, but it doesn't sound like they're going to make it easy on him. Sounds like he's going to have some competition with Kool-Aid McKinstry coming in. So if Kool-Aid ends up winning, I don't know that he wins an outside role. I think you're pretty solid there when it comes to Marshawn Lattimore and Paulson Adebo. The slot, though, things could get really interesting there. And then it becomes very, very interesting about what that means for Alontae Taylor moving forward. My expectation as of right now is that you still got Marshall Lattimore, Paul Sidibe on the outside, then Alontae Taylor will start in the slot. And then you have this fantastic fourth cornerback that you can fall back on when one of those guys has an injury or misses some time or misses a game, whatever it might be, because that's going to happen. So not the end of the world for Kool-Aid McKinstry not to win a starting role. Doesn't mean that he's a bust. Doesn't mean it doesn't work out. It's kind of like Isaiah Foskey, who was a second-round pick last year, but at best was going to be the fourth or fifth edge rusher on the roster last year. So now he comes into this year with a little bit more to prove. I think you would expect that when it comes to Kool-Aid McKinstry as well. And if that were to remain the case, it wouldn't be disappointing by any stretch of the imagination. But boy, could he make some noise if he ends up stealing a starting role from somebody, particularly in the slot, because you also have a guy like Alontae Taylor who then could also be competing on the outside if he loses his spot in the slot, and things get really, really intriguing from that point forward. Another spot in the secondary amongst the defensive backs that becomes very interesting is the safety spot. So safety, we expect right now the safety next to Tyrann Mathieu to be Jonathan Abram. But Jonathan Abram, second year safety, Jordan Howden, veteran safeties, Ugo Amadi, Will Harris, who have a lot of versatility, and longtime Saint JT Gray will all get their opportunities to show that they can play in that role as well. So it's the young guy for me, Jordan Howden, that I feel like creates the most intrigue. He has the most unknown about him outside of Will Harris, who was a bit of a Swiss Army knife do-it-all guy for the Detroit Lions, who, of course, remember, defensive coordinator there, Aaron Glenn, former secondary coach here in New Orleans. So there's a little bit of overlap in terms of language, coaching styles, things like that for Will Harris. So he should fit in just fine here in New Orleans. So he could potentially make things very interesting as well. What I do know when it comes to Jordan Howden is that, first of all, coaching staff absolutely loves him. Same thing for Jonathan Abram. Would never discount Jonathan Abram for that. Love the way that he communicates. Love the aggression that he plays with. Love the fact that he looks so good next to Tyrann Mathieu for those last two games last season. Same thing. They love both of these guys. But one of the things that's really intriguing about Jordan Howden is that they want him to get more opportunities in the box. Now, that could mean one of two things. It could mean that, A, they have him compete as that box safety, which is the role that Jonathan Abram feels like he's got a pretty good firm grasp on right now. Or it could also simply mean that the Saints return Jordan Howden to the role where he started off his rookie season, which was being the dime package or sixth defensive back out on the field on those third down, heavy passing down type situations, which effectively asks you to play kind of almost like a second slot, right? You're playing in the box. You're like a dime linebacker in a way. And Jordan Howden definitely has the build, the strength, the tackling ability, and the awareness of watching things develop, everything like that, and reacting to all that to play that role throughout this season. And maybe that carries him forward to his next opportunity, which could be eventually taking Tyrann Mathieu's place or stepping into a role vacated by Tyrann Mathieu at a later point in their career. So we'll see exactly what happens with Jordan Howden, but it won't be a quiet offseason for the second year, almost said second round, for the second year safety. Coming up next, wide receiver 3, or the third wide receiver spot behind Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed, all but sewn up, and it could be entirely down to game plan in terms of who gets the third most targets at wide receiver behind their two stars. We got that coming up for you as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. It can be challenging sometimes, especially in today's world, because we tend to compare our lives to others. Maybe social media plays a little bit of a role in that. But in any case, what do you do when you get caught up in the idea of wishing that your life was like someone else's? Well, therapy helped me through something kind of similar to that. I had a lot of envious things, wanting bigger, wanting better, wanting all these other things, but not necessarily appreciating what was directly in front of me. And that was one of the things that therapy really helped me do, was focus on what it is that I have, as opposed to being so focused on what it is that I wanted or was wishing for. So if you've been thinking about therapy, or if you've been feeling something similar to this, maybe therapy can be helpful. And I would suggest in that case to definitely give BetterHelp a try. It is entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. It is great. So stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp today. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off of your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wide receiver 3, or rather, the third wide receiver for the New Orleans Saints, I'll explain my delineation there here in a moment, is a position that is far from sewn up, and there's certainly going to be a lot of competition to see who will be the next most targeted wide receiver, next most snap-getting wide receiver behind Rashid, Shaheed, and Chris Olave, the Saints' 2 stars at the position. We appreciate you very much, as always, for being here. Don't forget, we are your team every day. So coming up tomorrow, we're going to take a look at a couple things. First of all, the Saints closing in on a deal that could potentially keep them in New Orleans for up to the next 3 decades. That's awesome. We'll also take a look at why the Saints should still consider adding some free agents before training camp begins and what that could look like. We got all that coming up for you in tomorrow's episode as we continue on here on Tuesday. So here, as we wrap up our Monday episode, what I want to focus on now is looking at wide receiver. Then we're going to take a look at a little bit of special teams too, but I want to focus on wide receiver for a moment. Behind Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed, there's a big opportunity for some wide receiver to kind of be the third next option, right? Or the next / third option. I want to be really careful about how I talk about this position, because I think oftentimes when people hear wide receiver 3, they think about a certain specific place where that wide receiver will line up, typically the slot. That shouldn't be and is kind of unlikely to be the way that the New Orleans Saints offense will operate. When we talk about wide receiver 3 or the third wide receiver, we're really talking about like who's the third focus at wide receiver behind Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed, right? Being number 3 is less about where you line up on the field, as Chris Olave will line up on the outside sometimes and then will line up in the slot sometimes. And in any case, he would be, quote, wide receiver 1, the number 1 option, but might not take all of the snaps as an X receiver or the split end weak side lone receiver over on the team's weak side. So I want to be really careful about the language that we're using here, because the thing that can be very fascinating about the New Orleans Saints offense in 2024 is that Chris Olave can line up outside in the slot. Rashid Shaheed can line up outside in the slot. They can also line up on either side of the field. And similarly, the New Orleans Saints have a lot of players that can move all about. And one of the ones that is most intriguing to me, or the 2 that are most intriguing to me, rather, are A.T. Perry and Cedrick Wilson. A.T. Perry, going into his second year, had a phenomenal, I don't want to call it phenomenal, had a really, really good rookie season and a phenomenal close to his rookie season, I think is the right way that I would say this. Really stood out in those last handful of games, week 13 on, in those opportunities that he got after Michael Thomas's season basically came to an end following the Minnesota Vikings game, or the game against the Minnesota Vikings in Minnesota. Cedrick Wilson, though, is a free agent coming in who in 2021 played his best season as a slot receiver. Meanwhile, A.T. Perry plays his best football, it feels, and the majority of his football on the outside, although he has made it a point to show that he can play in the slot if asked. Now, the Saints also have Equanimeous St. Brown that can be a part of this conversation, undrafted free agents Mason Tipton and Jermaine Jackson and others, right? They've got a lot of guys that could be in this conversation. But I think that A.T. Perry and Cedrick Wilson are the ones that are going to be the most solidly competitive pair when it comes to this role. And I think it might not be up to them. I think that if both make the roster, which is certainly the expectation at this time, the New Orleans Saints gave out nothing but 1-year deals this offseason, except for the 2-year deal that they gave the wide receiver, Cedrick Wilson. A.T. Perry, of course, coming into his second year, ain't nobody moving on from him. They like him a lot. So I look at both of those guys, and it's very clear that they're going to be on the roster. So then how do they contribute? How do they get all this done? Now, the other person that makes this conversation really interesting, too, is Bub Means, by the way. But I don't know if the Saints are going to be ready to rush him into a big role right away. I think that Bub Means' role, as we've seen with several wide receivers over the course of the past few years, A.T. Perry, Rashid Shaheed, Deontay Hardy, Harris at the time when he joined the team, we'll see his role pick up over the course of his rookie season. So to start the season, I'm looking at A.T. Perry and Cedrick Wilson, but I think that it's going to come down to the game plan that's going to dictate which one of them is truly the quote-unquote third option behind Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed, more than it will be something that is consistent over the course of the season. What I mean by that is that A.T. Perry is an outside receiver. If the Saints feel that he is a good matchup for any given down, any given play, any given game plan in any given game, then he could end up being that guy. Let's say that you're going up against a team with an injured outside corner or an undersized outside corner, A.T. Perry, perfect for that matchup. Similarly, if they're going up against a team that doesn't have very good play when it comes to slot coverage or has diminutive size when it comes to their play in slot coverage, then maybe a big-bodied, big slot option like Cedrick Wilson becomes a more present part of the game plan in that case. So I think that it's going to be more dictated by the game plan, but both of these guys sort of maintaining their footing throughout training camp is going to be important, especially with Bub Means breathing down everybody's neck, because there is the chance that he upsets a lot of this conversation and maybe takes a little bit of a greater leap than we expect. How many wide receivers will the New Orleans Saints keep? All of that is also going to be a part of the conversation here. What's interesting is that if you look behind Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed from the 2023 season, the receiver with the most targets was Michael Thomas with 64. All 64 of those targets are now vacated because Michael Thomas ain't on the team anymore. The guy behind MT was AT when it came to wide receivers only, right? There's tight ends and running backs that are split into that as well. But when it comes to the wide receivers, behind MT was AT with 18, okay? So I would expect that to continue to tick up for A.T. Perry, of course, but then where does Cedrick Wilson fit in? Where does Equanimity St. Brown fit in if he makes the roster? And if somebody shows him, other restaurants to go to in New Orleans before judging New Orleans cuisine, then Drago's. And then, of course, Bub Means, who could potentially slip into this conversation along with others as well. So I think that wide receiver spot, let's just call it the one behind Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed, becomes a big time focus over the course of this offseason, and we'll see who ends up being able to contribute from that spot because it's going to be important. Saints are going to play a lot of 2 wide receiver sets, but a quote unquote lot of 2 wide receiver sets is not going to be more than, probably 30 to 40% of their total snaps. In fact, that would even be pretty extraordinary if they played that many 2 wide receiver sets. So that third wide receiver or the 3 wide receiver set is still going to hit the field, and they need to have their options there. As we wrap up, you might have a kicker battle. We might have a punter battle. To be honest, we don't know right now. Blake Grupe, the incumbent at kicker, could potentially be challenged by Charlie Smith. I didn't see anything during mini camps and OTAs out on that field to suggest that there was a big-time battle on the way. However, or that there was a big-time battle that has already been engaged. However, the Saints will not turn a blind eye if Charlie Smith makes things interesting in training camp. So I think there could be a position battle there. I wouldn't say that if things continued in the trajectory that they're going right now, that there will be. Same thing when it comes to punter. Lou Hedley and undrafted free agent Matthew Hayball. Hedley has added the traditional, or has been working this offseason to add the traditional NFL punt style to his rugby punt style. Things could get interesting over the course of training camp, but as of right now, not very interesting just yet. Doesn't mean that it won't get there, though. So kicker and punter still going to be something worth watching because those position battles could be generated and could go the distance, no pun intended, kicker, punter distance, could go the distance come training camp and throughout training camp. As of right now, though, Groupie Hedley feels safe, but I don't think that they should feel comfortable just yet. We appreciate you very much, as always, y'all, for joining us for another episode of Locked On Saints. Hope you enjoyed running through these position battles for the New Orleans Saints. Are there other position battles you're interested in or that you think could be interesting? If so, let me know. Come to tomorrow, I'll let you know why the New Orleans Saints should absolutely still be considering looking at free agents and adding free agents before going into training camp, who they could be, and how the New Orleans Saints could get that done. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making us your first listen of the day every day. So for your second listen, does Brandon Ingram want out of New Orleans? And is he looking for a trade partner? What could that mean for the New Orleans Pelicans? Go and check out Jake Madison over at Locked On Pels. And one of the LSU Tiger baseball recruits was set to join, but was selected like 9th overall in the MLB draft. What does that mean for LSU baseball? Matt Moscona's got it for you over at Locked On LSU. We appreciate you very much, as always, making us a party day part of your routine for saying yes to me in the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust to that nation, I'll holla at you. I am your host, your Ross. Okay. That's the way. Not your friend, your Ross. I am your host, your Ross.